Hello, and welcome to the first lecture for Topic 6. Topic 6 deals with the United States Congress, and I just wanted to point out that we are moving forward in our chapters. So the last chapter that you read was Chapter 5, but we move forward to Chapter 12 in order to get to the institutions. So I'd want to point that out as you are preparing for your reading. So what are we going to be taking a look in this lecture? Well, Topic 6 is the beginning of a new unit for this class, Unit 2. And so in Unit 2, we begin looking at institutions of government. And the first institution that we start with is the United States Congress. And so this lecture is dedicated to providing an overview of the United States Congress. We're going to take a quick look at the difference between the House and the Senate, the two chambers that make up the United States Congress. And then we're going to look at some sort of critical thinking questions that are derived from the material in your textbook and the articles that you're going to be reading, asking broad questions about the role of democracy and Congress. So let's get started. Okay, so let's start with some basics. So the federal legislature is known as the United States Congress. As you know, it's established by Article 1 of the Constitution. The Congress is bicameral. Again, we know this from earlier work we've done this semester. It has two chambers, and these chambers are significantly different. One of the chambers is called the United States House of Representatives. The other is the United States Senate. So just a little refresher of some of the things we learned about earlier in this semester. Okay, and so we are currently in the 116th Congress. It runs from January 3rd, 2019 to January 3rd, 2021. We number our Congresses and have done so since the ratification of the United States Constitution in 1789. So every 2 years, a new Congress starts. That's because every 2 years, all of the members of the House of Representatives stand for re-election, and 1/3 of the Senate stands for re-election. And so what that means is that every 2 years we have new members of these two chambers. On November 30th, as you know, we have a presidential election coming up, and on that date you'll also be voting for members of the House of Representatives. In Wisconsin, neither of our senators is up for re-election, but that's not true in other states. And so we may see a change of hands in one of these two chambers. Currently, the Democrats, as I think most of us know, have the majority in the House of Representatives. They have 232 members to the Republicans' 197 members. And for the first time, we have an actual libertarian, a third party member, who is serving in the House of Representatives. And his name is Justin Amash. Justin Amash used to be a Republican. He switched to being an independent, and just recently he switched to identify with the Libertarian Party. We have 6 non-voting members, and so in places that are territories of the United States, like Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, Puerto Rico, and D.C. as well, they have delegates that they send to the House of Representatives. They get to participate, but they do not get to vote. They would get to vote if they were made states to the Union. And currently there are 5 vacancies in the House of Representatives, which will likely be filled in this upcoming election. The Senate is in the hands of the Republicans. There are 53 Republicans to 45 Democrats, and there are 2 independents, both who caucus with the Democrats, and that's Angus King from Maine and Bernie Sanders from Vermont. So for all practical purposes, it is 53 to 47. We'll see whether or not the Senate changes hands in the 2020 election. It's possible, but it's not necessarily a done deal. Okay, as you'll read in your textbook, there are big differences between the House and the Senate. Probably the biggest difference between the House and the Senate is the way in which differences in representation. As we know from work we've done earlier in the semester, that each state gets at least one representative, regardless of how many people live in your state. You could have 5 people live in your state and you would still get one representative. And the most that any state currently has is 53 representatives, and that's the state of California. And how many uh, representatives each state gets is based on population. So the more populous your state is, the more representatives you have. As we know, that's not the case with the Senate. Regardless of your population, each state gets 2 senators. There are other differences as well. That the minimum age for members of the House is 5 years less than the Senate. You do not need to be a natural born citizen to serve in the House or the Senate, but you need to be a U.S. citizen for a period of time. For the House, it's 7 years, and for the Senate, it's 9. The length of term is different, and and there are no term limits. That means that while the length of the term for a member of the House is 2 years, if they continue to run, they need to be reelected every 2 years. The term in the Senate is 6 years. But there are no term limits. So a senator or a member of the House can run for reelection as many times as they desire, and they will keep that seat until their constituents decide not to reelect them or they decide to retire. There are other differences as well. A member of the House represents their specific congressional district. And so what they're concerned about is a lot more local. So that a member of the House who represents the Milwaukee area, their interests and concern are going to be tailored to the interests and concerns of the people who live in Milwaukee, versus somebody who represents the northern part of the state. Their interests are going to be local to those concerns, having to do with agriculture, forestry, etc. Senate, because they represent the state as a whole, that their interests and their constituents are much broader. And so they represent everybody in the state, regardless of where that person lives. The Senate is smaller. It is more decentralized. You're going to learn that it's more deliberative in the way it makes decisions. It also has more status. So it's actually you're seen as having more power as a senator than if you're a member of the House. The House is much larger, it is much more centralized, and the leaders in the House have a lot more power to conduct legislative business. And you'll be learning about that in your textbook. This is just a slide that shows you the number of seats that each state gets in the House of Representatives. It also shows you a general breakdown of how each of these states sort of vote. And so if it's a red state, that indicates that those states have a majority of representatives who are Republican. The redder your state is, the more likely that all, if not most, of your representatives are Republican. The bluer your state is, the more Democratic your state is. And so you'll see that California is very blue, whereas a state like Arizona is lighter blue, indicating that their House makeup leans towards Democratic. Wisconsin, we have 5 of our representatives for the House are Republican and 3 are Democratic. So we're a light pink state, more Republican than Democratic, but somewhat split evenly. So let's take a look at Wisconsin. So Wisconsin, based on its population, it gets 8 congressional districts. It has 8 members in the House of Representatives. We obviously get 2 senators as well. And so in Wisconsin, we have 1 Republican Senator Ron Johnson, and we have 1 Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin. They have both stood for re-election, Tammy more than once, Ron Johnson at least once. So they are incumbents, and they've been in office for some time. Um, with the House of Representatives, we see that as I mentioned in the former slide, that we get 8 members of the House, and of those, 5 are in the red, they're Republicans, and 3 are blue, and they are the Democrats. And so if you live in the Milwaukee area, you either most likely live in the 4th or the 5th district. The 4th district represents Milwaukee proper and the outlying suburbs. But the 5th district, so kind of the northern suburbs and some of the southern suburbs as well. But moving west is the 5th district. So if you live in Waukesha or West Bend, you're most likely in the 5th district. And that is represented by Jim Sensenbrenner. The 4th district is represented by Gwen Moore. Next to their names are also numbers, and that tells you when they were elected. Jim Sensenbrenner has been representing the 5th district. He's been in Congress since '79. And in fact, this is his last year. And so as you vote if you live in the 5th district and you are voting, you will see that Jim Sensenbrenner is not running. Scott Fitzgerald, who is a part of the Wisconsin State Legislature, is running as the Republican, and Tom Palzowitz is running as the Democrat. It's most likely that Scott Fitzgerald will win that race because that is a district that is heavily leans to the Republicans. Okay, so let's just do some critical thinking about democracy and the 2 chambers of the United States Senate. The first thing we're going to look at is the Senate. And as it says there, that the Senate is undemocratic. It's an undemocratic institution by design. Now, when I use the word democratic in these following sides or undemocratic, I'm not talking about the Democratic Party. We're talking about democracy, democratic, small d. And what that means is that usually when we think about democracy, we sort of think about that when we make decisions, it's majority rules, that what the most people want is what gets translated into policy or gets translated into who gets elected. Okay? But as we also know that when our framers created Congress, that they made some choices, and they were basically worried about the tyranny of the majority. And so they designed our Congress to have one chamber that was based on population, coming close to sort of democratic rule, small d, right? And another chamber that is by design a little less democratic. That is that by design, every state gets the same voice in the Senate, regardless of how many people live in their states. So as it says there, states with a smaller population have more power than states with a larger population. And that was intentional. It was designed that way. Keep in mind that our framers, while they saw the good aspects of majority rule, they also realized that the majority can act as a tyrant, that if every decision is made by 50% plus 1, then those folks that are in the 49% never get their voices heard. So they wanted to make sure that our institutions were designed to place a brake on the majority, the will of the majority, and to give enhanced power to the less populous states. And so the Senate is undemocratic, but by design, and there's a lot of wisdom in putting the brakes on the straight up will of the majority. Even though the Senate is, by design, gives more power to states with less population, that the ratio of the largest to the smallest state has changed significantly since the founding. And so in 1791, that when you compared the largest state, which was the state of Virginia, largest in terms of population, the state of Virginia, to the smallest, least populous state, Delaware, that the ratio was 12-1, right? In other words, the population of Virginia was 12 times that of the population of Delaware. Significant a difference, but that's just what the ratio is. Today in 2018, which isn't today, it's 2020, but that's the last election that we had, that when you compare the population of the most populous state, which is California, to the least populous state, which is Wyoming, there's a much greater gap. And so the population of California is nearly 40 million people, and the population of Wyoming is almost half of a million people, a little bit more. It's 579,000. And so California is 68 times the population of Wyoming. Yet they still get 2 senators each. So if we continue with the population growth that we've had in the last up until 2020, and we'll know more after the 2020 census, that if we're looking at population growth and where people go to live, okay, that some are predicting that by 2040, that 70% of the United States population will live in 15 states, but they will only get 30% of the representation in the Senate, right? In other words, the voice of 70% of the population is really cut in more than half in the Senate, okay? And you could look at the other way. You could say that 30% of the population gets more than double its voice in Congress, okay? So here are some critical thinking questions to think about. So the framers clearly wanted to give magnified power to less populous state. That was part of their design. But what do you think? If the framers came back today and saw that ratio from 1 to 12 to 68 to 1, right, that we have today, right, or 12 to 1 to 68 to 1, how do you think they would respond? With that big gap in terms of the population representation, would they be concerned? Have we moved from tyranny of the majority or concerns about majority rules and tyranny of the majority, where we've given the minority voice, the less populous states, so much power to make decisions in the Senate that it's become tyranny of the majority? And if that is the case, how would we, if the framers came back and saw that and they'd say, whoa, we're giving way too much voice to the less populous states, what kind of remedy do you think that they might come up with, if any? Okay, let's turn our sights to the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives, because it is based on population, is more democratic, but it still has some problems. So currently there are 435 seats in the United States House of Representatives. Each of those seats represents a congressional district. And so in the previous slide, we saw that Wisconsin has 8 congressional districts. And in each of those districts, regardless of what state you live in, there are the same number of people in each of those districts. That's because representation is based on population. And so each of the congressional districts has approximately 710,000 people in it. Now, if you go back and you look at the slide of Wisconsin, you'll see that the 4th congressional district that Representative Gwen Moore represents, geographically, that's very small. That's because the population is so dense in the Milwaukee area. But if you look at some of the congressional districts up north, in particular the 7th district, geographically, that district is really large, but it has the same number of people in it. It's just that a lot of the people up there are more spread out because it's less densely populated. So each of those districts represents 710,000 people. And every 10 years, in order to keep the Congress apportioned, we redraw the district lines based on the results of the census. And so every 10 years, we take a census, and then we use that information in order to redraw districts' lines. Now, the state legislatures are in control of redrawing those lines. And so that once we get the results of the census, that information goes to the state legislature, and then they're charged with redrawing the lines to keep them apportioned. However, politics plays a role in that, and whichever party has the majority within the state legislature, they are going to redraw those lines in a way that benefits their party. And Democrats do it just like Republicans do it. This isn't that it's whichever party has control in the state legislature are going to redraw lines in a way to favor them. And that's what's known as partisan gerrymandering. You're going to be learning about this in the textbook. So partisan gerrymandering is redrawing the lines in a congressional district boundaries in a way to give your party a numerical advantage over an opposing party. You'll read more about this in the textbook, but imagine that there's a district in Wisconsin right now that's sort of split evenly between the Democrats and the Republicans. It's like a 50-50 district. It's a purple district. Well, if the Democrats are in charge of the legislature, they might redraw those district lines to make that district have more Democrats in it, because that'll give them a better chance of winning that. And if you're a Republican, you might do the same. And so that's even though the districts are apportioned, the lines can be redrawn in a way to favor one party over another, that thus taking us sort of farther away from the true will of the people within that state. So let's take a look at Wisconsin. So Wisconsin has 8 congressional districts, and our congressional districts are drawn by the state legislature, so they can be tampered with in terms of gerrymandering. But it goes even farther than that. That you only vote for your representative in the congressional district that you live in. So if you live in Wisconsin 5, you vote for the representative that represents the Wisconsin 5th congressional district. And we'll be learning about this more later in the semester, but the way that our elections work is that it's a single member that represents each of the congressional districts, and whoever gets the most votes wins that district. And so if there are multi-party candidates who are running and you get 40% of the vote, it's not the majority, but if nobody gets more than 40%, then you're the winner. Winner take all. Now, Wisconsin, when you look at the electorate of Wisconsin, it's mixed. The most recent Marquette poll that was just taken and released a few days ago, they asked people what their party identification was. And it's like 1/3 of Wisconsin identifies as Republican, 1/3 of Wisconsin identifies as Democrat, and 1/3, actually more than 1/3, says that they don't have a party affiliation. They consider themselves independent. So Wisconsin has a mixed electorate, yet over 60% of the House seats are in the hands of the Republicans, 5 out of the 8, okay? And that's not likely to change anytime soon, given the way that the district lines are drawn up. That you learn about this in the textbook, but we pack Democrats into one district, making it a really safe seat for the Democrats, and we pack Republicans in another district, making it a really safe seat. We don't have a lot of purple districts anymore, and that's also, your textbook is going to be talking about that. It's not just about gerrymandering, but it's also that people go and they sort themselves. They go, if you're a Democrat, you go live in an urban area. If you're a Republican, you're more likely to move to a rural area, right? And so that's not likely to change, and so that how we get represented in the House, it kind of falls short to the way that the electorate of the Wisconsin actually looks like. So the partisan makeup of the Wisconsin electorate does not get fully translated in how Wisconsin is represented in the House of Representatives. There is a change that we could make if we wanted to that might get us closer to getting closer to the will of the people and translating that into who represents us. And it's what's known as proportional representation. And proportional representation could bring us closer to the will of the people. Well, what is a proportional representation? And how does it also relate to the party identification of the folks that live in our state? Well, in the previous slide, I mentioned that in the most recent Marquette poll, we're kind of split 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, okay? Well, that if you use proportional representation, rather than having single districts that are winner take all, we would actually have a statewide election and that multiple parties would run on the ballot and you would vote for your party, okay? And so if there are 8 seats up for grabs, the Democrats would run 8 people, the Republicans would run 8 people and say if they won 100% of the vote, then all of the 8 people would get those 8 seats. But then other parties could put forward their ticket for who, if they won 100% of the election, who would take those 8 seats. So the Libertarians, you could see who their 8 candidates are. The Green Party, the Socialist Party, the Beer Drinker Party, whatever. They would all show us who their 8 candidates are. And then on the day of the election, you would go in and you wouldn't vote for your single district, but you would vote for your party. And so in a hypothetical election result, let's say we did that in Wisconsin based on sort of the breakdown of party ID within the electorate of Wisconsin. That the hypothetical election results would be that 30% of the electorate voted for the Republican Party ticket, 30% voted for the Democratic Party ticket, 20% voted Libertarian, let's say, and 20% voted for the Green Party, okay? Because they might feel more confident voting for a third party because they feel like, hell, we actually might get a chance because we could get a seat even though we don't come in first, right? We could get a seat with only 20% of the vote. So people might be more likely to vote that way. And so if we divided up our House seats proportionally, then Republicans would get 3 of our seats, Democrats would get 3 of the seats, Libertarians would get 1, and the Greens would get 1, okay? Giving us sort of a closer, like reducing the gap between like how the people identify in Wisconsin and who represents the state of Wisconsin in the House of Representatives. So this will just lead us to some critical thinking questions as you're thinking about representation in the House. Do you think it would be more democratic, small d, to adopt proportional representation for House seats? From what I've read, we leave the decisions about how we elect our members of the House, we leave those decisions to the state. And so it's quite possible that we could adopt proportional representation or some, variant of that, and it would be constitutional. Later in the semester, we're going to actually be having a discussion about would a multi-party system be beneficial. But if we did adopt proportional representation, we probably would get more third-party candidates serving in the House. Would that be a positive thing, a negative thing? What are the advantages and the disadvantages of that? And when we think about a redistricting, so if we were to keep the single district winner-take-all method of how we currently vote for our members of the House, should we take politics out of the mix? In other words, should redistricting be nonpartisan rather than having the state legislature and the party that has the most people in the state legislature draw up those party lines, there would be an incentive to do some partisan gerrymandering? Should we give that task to a nonpartisan board that doesn't have any party leaning one way or the other in order to draw up those lines rather than having the state legislature to do it? All right, just some things to think about critically as we are learning about Congress. Thanks for your time.